Hugh, it's lovely to see you. And for anybody who's watching the video rather than listening to the podcast, they may be interested to see that you're wearing a woolly hat, and we're in the summer now, right? And you've got a bit of a jacket on. What's going on there?
Well, today's cold, actually. It doesn't feel at all like summer, and we'll come to climate change later on, but there's a massive crisis here. So it's much cheaper and simpler and low carbon to insulate myself than it is to heat my flat. So hence the multiple layers and the woolly hat on. Not very elegant, but it does the job.
We'll come back to that, and we'll come back to understand a bit more of that. But I think where I'd like to start, if I may, is the documentary that came out in the height of the COVID pandemic. Those of us who watched it, and it was called The Story of Us, finally had a real insight into what was going on in the intensive care unit where you were working, and what the NHS was dealing with. That was a really brave thing to do. And did you ever have any doubts about allowing cameras into the ICU?
Well, no, in fact, the project started pre-COVID, oddly enough. So I was getting increasingly concerned that people didn't know what intensive care was. And whilst it can save lives, it is a brutal experience. Pre-COVID, around a quarter of people who went to intensive care died. Stays there are undignified, painful. There's up to 80% of people with unplanned admissions have major psychiatric problems after admission. Up to 5 years later, people still have functional debility. The majority of people working age can't go back to work even within a year of an unplanned admission. And yet it had this magical sense that, oh, my mum would want everything, without really understanding what everything was. So we planned a documentary to show what intensive care was, to help people understand whether they'd actually want it or whether it was the right thing for a relative. And we were about to do it when suddenly COVID struck. So the company that we were working with contacted and said, well, I suppose that's all washed up then. And we said, well, actually, no, you're in pole position. You've got the permissions to go for it. Let's just do it. And it was pulled together. A lot of the footage was onto camera phones because we couldn't get them into the units to start with. But that's where it came from, really. They were just ready to go. It was Kevin MacDonald, the Oscar-winning director, who was doing it.
And it was a fantastic program. It really did give us some insights and really showed us the developments that were going on. And I mean, it seems like we're so far away from it now. It's 2 years on. But is COVID over? Can we relax?
No, it's not over. It for lots of reasons. COVID itself, of course, the landscape's changed. We got a constant mutation in the virus. We're now running one of the many Omicron variants, which is highly contagious, much, much more infectious than the previous versions, but generally much milder in its impacts. We've got some new drugs and treatments that we can give people. And of course, we've got a vaccination program, which has really changed the landscape for us. So we're seeing far fewer admissions, but we are still seeing them, particularly the people who've refused vaccination and the people with immunocompromise, people whose immune systems don't work well. Because they're ill with, let's say, a blood cancer, or because we've suppressed their immune systems, let's say, to stop them rejecting a transplanted organ. So we still see those people. And we're not out of the woods. I mean, the fact that it's mutated in this direction, there's a story that everything mutates to become a more benign, mild illness. And that's not true. It probably will in the end, but we could easily come up with a much nastier version soon. And of course, it's not just COVID. We've got a raft of other diseases coming in. We've got another nasty flu season coming. It looks like a bird flu. We look towards Australia because it's their winter at the moment, and what they get then comes to us. And that looks as if it'll be a bad season. We've got lots of other emerging diseases. We've had 17 spillover events since the year 2000. So these bugs are jumping across to humans ever more frequently. And currently, as we're recording now, we've gone from a standing start of no monkeypox cases really to speak of outside Africa a couple of weeks ago to 127 in the United Kingdom yesterday. So yeah, lots of challenges.
Wow. Wow. And how worried should we be about monkeypox? Should we start being careful because we were very slow to react to COVID?
Well, yeah, we should be careful. I mean, for most people, it's a bit like chickenpox. So for most people, they're not going to get terribly unwell. It's not going to kill them. But that said, chickenpox isn't a particularly fun disease to have. And it will have its complications if it does start spreading, because the incubation period can be anywhere between around 5 and 21 days. And close contact of a case, so within a meter or skin to skin contact, will require at the moment 21 days of isolation. So if this does spread, it's going to become quite a big disruptor.
Wow. Gosh, it's like certainly the world has changed, hasn't it? We're constantly being disrupted. You worry about computer viruses. We should be worrying about human viruses much more.
Yeah, and it's human. We can come to it later, but we're causing it. You know, this is our own stupidity that's coming home to roost, really.
Yeah, I'm afraid that probably is the case. So you've worked in extreme environments, and how did that help you in the work that you were doing in intensive care?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I think there's a great value in plurality in life. I mean, the more you know about across broad spheres, the more you can make connections that others can't. And one of the issues we had in intensive care, or two actually, were that muscle wastes away very aggressively. If you've got multi-system failure, you can use on average around 2.6% of your muscle mass a day. And we also know that many patients on intensive care have a reduced oxygen delivery, whether it's because their lungs aren't working or their heart's not pumping well, or they haven't got enough red cells, or the small blood vessels aren't working. And you can't really unpick those things in intensive care easily, because everything you measure will be out of the box and you don't know what's cause, what's effect, and what's just a bystander. So one way to investigate those things is to take healthy people and just disturb one thing. And of course, if you take people to altitude, there isn't very much oxygen, and they also happen to waste away. So we did a lot of work, for instance, there, taking people to high mountains, including Everest, and running lab even on the South Col of Everest, taking muscle biopsies and so forth. And we have cracked the process of how humans adapt to low oxygen levels. And we're able to take that back to patients on intensive care and find, in fact, it's exactly the same process, unsurprisingly. It's just regulated in a slightly different fashion. So we now do understand how that works. We did the same thing with heart growth. Having a big, thick heart, for instance, in response to a genetic problem or high blood pressure, is not good for you. You can't really do experiments ethically on humans, but you can if you look at healthy, fit people, in this case, army recruits who become very fit over 10 weeks, and you can measure the heart growth and use genetic tools to find where their hearts are growing. And you can then take that back to people with diseased hearts. And the same with bones. You can look at the bone changes in young, fit men with exercise, do the genetics, and then find it's the same genes regulating osteoporosis in old women. So there are lots of ways in by studying extreme environmental change, such as low oxygen levels or intense exercise.
As an old woman, I'm interested in the bone thing. I'll talk to you about that separately. That's interesting. Okay, fantastic. And what has COVID and all these things that have been going on since 2000, you mentioned 17, I don't know what the term was that you used, but what have these things taught us? And can the NHS survive with these constant new viruses?
Well, dealing with those questions in reverse order, the NHS can't survive in its current form. And the reason for that is we have more and more old people living longer and longer with more and more comorbidities, as we call them. So elderly people don't tend to just have one thing wrong. They have multiple things wrong. And those are synergistic. So they make healthcare even more complicated in terms of tests and so forth and what you can do. We can do more and more, and all of those things are more and more expensive. And it's not a bottomless pit. We can't keep pouring money into more and more people needing more and more with greater expectations and demands that they should have it with more and more that we can do. That's not possible, and it's not survivable. The answer actually is relatively straightforward. A vast amount of the illness we treat in the health service is entirely preventable. So if you look at my intensive care unit, a critically ill patient will cost you, the taxpayer, for each single patient around £3,000 per patient per day. You could float pretty much any small intensive care on the stock market if it was a business. It's a very expensive thing. And you could look across the whole healthcare system, but you could remove the majority of patients from that environment if we had clean, unpolluted air, if people were able to take exercise, to walk and to cycle to work and to use their bodies, if we didn't have ultra-processed foods and too many calories going in to manage the obesity epidemic, and if we dealt with education and inequity such that we managed alcohol and drug consumption in a different way, and if you got rid of obesity, lack of exercise, polluted air, cigarettes, alcohol, drugs, I would have very, very little work left to do. And what you then have is a healthy, productive population who aren't draining the taxpayers' money, who are contributing their taxes because they're still at work, and we turn the tap off. And that is much cheaper because that can be done at a policy level. It doesn't have to cost us pretty much anything to do those things. In fact, there's probably taxation benefit to doing it too. But it's something that no government has grasped. In fact, every government in the last 20 years has dismantled public health. I'm the turkey voting for Christmas here. You should be sacking people like me and putting the money into public healthcare. In terms of the threats coming from these spillover events, these are sort of viruses and bugs that are in animals that jump to humans and then spread in humans. And we really don't have them very commonly. In the last 100 years, we had maybe 3. We had bird flu, the Spanish flu after the First War. We had simian immunodeficiency virus, or SIV, that jumped to humans to become HIV, probably in the 1930s, and then mutated in the 80s to give us the HIV epidemic. And then we had a couple of Ebola events from bats jumping into humans. But since 2002, we've had endless numbers: MERS, SARS-CoV-1, SARS-CoV-2, Zika virus. We've had strep suis from pigs. We've had bird flus. And this results really from the way humans treat the planet. We're chopping down rainforests. We're destroying ecosystems. We're getting climate change, which means that animals are migrating into each other's territories. So we're forcing feces, fur, and feathers and animals together that should never be together at high density. We've got wet meat markets, we've got massive human ingress. So suddenly large numbers of people in what was once rainforest, for instance. So we create the perfect conditions for things to jump over. We have monocultures of animals. 72% of birds on the planet are now farmed poultry. And there were 19 million mink being farmed during COVID, which became a massive sump of COVID swapping between mink. And then you had 146 people a second boarding a jet plane to spread these things around the world. And then we're surprised when we get hit repeatedly. So unless we change our ways, the way we treat our planet, COVID won't be the last, and it won't be the most nasty either. There's a lot worse coming down the pipe, I've no doubt.
Wow, that's rather sobering thinking there, sobering content to absorb. Wow, okay. So how are humans going to survive? What are the secrets of human survival?
Well, there are some short-term things. I've done a lot of research, as you know, about that over the years, about why one person lives and one person dies. So at an individual level, part of it is luck, and part of it is circumstance. You know, if you happen to be on the boat that hits the whale or something, if you're on a sailing vessel and your boat sinks, that's bad luck. If you're someone who can't swim, well, there you were in the wrong place, probably, or the wrong environment. And if the seas are rough and very cold, then things are stacked against you. So there is just bad luck. On top of that, there is a lot of psychology, which interplays with the biology, interestingly enough. So the way you think and feel strongly determines your survival chances. So we know, obviously, it's hard to interview dead people unless you're a medium, but when you interview survivors of disasters, you can get a very clear view of their psychology compared to what they describe happening to the people who died. So in boats that go down, for instance, the survivors are immediately planning. They're immediately going, right, I'm going to need seaweed to cover myself. It's going to be hot tomorrow. Where's my food coming from? Can I salvage that? How do I keep myself warm? Do I keep the sun off myself? The non-survivors are either seasick, which is the most powerful predictor outside not being able to swim, for instance, of survival, probably because it just renders you incapable of doing anything. You feel utterly miserable. But they also go into recrimination mode. Oh, it was Maria's fault. That's why the boat went down, whatever. Survivors tend to be very positive. They tend to always think they're going to get out of it. They just have to work out how and keep fighting to do it. They often are able to maintain a sense of humor when others can't, and still laugh when things are pretty terrible. And those things matter, not just because you keep fighting to live, but because we know that actually your mood changes your biology. So for instance, if you take little punch biopsies out of people and look how quickly they heal, if you do that in students in exam terms, they take much longer to heal, 4 days more to heal than in non-exam terms. If you do them in elderly ladies, because it tends to be ladies who look after us decrepit old blokes, but if you do that to carers when they're looking after the decrepit old bloke, compared to when the old bloke's in some respite care for a fortnight, 4.7 days quicker healing. Even with HIV, in fact, the people who were openly gay and therefore were not worried about people knowing, developed their AIDS-defining illnesses 2 years after those that were not open about their sexuality. So mood matters to even things like wound healing and infection risk. And then there's a whole bunch of other stuff like genetics, which matters. Everyone knows that your risk of breast cancer is related to a BRCA gene you inherit, for instance. And we all know that if your dad died of a heart attack early, you're more likely to. But actually, the risks, for instance, for infectious disease are much higher. If you've had a first-degree relative who died of an infection, you're 7 times more likely to die of an infection than someone else. So this is partly genetic. In terms of our survival, human survival, we're now down to the wire because of what we've done to our ecosystem, but particularly because of climate change. Most of the data now are suggesting that human civilization as we know it is facing a major threat of collapse within not the lifetimes of our grandchildren, but within the next 30 years or so. We are absolutely down to the last chance saloon now.
Wow, 30 years isn't very long. That's really not very long at all. And all of that information that you shared, I'm sort of trying to go through my genetic history and trying to remember who died of what, who's got this and who's got that. So that's fascinating stuff too. Before we go a bit deeper into climate change, I'd like to stay on the NHS, or go back to the NHS. Can artificial intelligence help us?
Well, yes, it can. It can in so many different ways. So the first thing, I suppose, is that we need to redefine diseases, because a good friend of mine, Lindsay Edwards, always says that most diseases were named by Victorian gentlemen in top hats, and they were syndromic, that if someone turned up with a particular pattern, then you called it a name and you said that it was an entity. Sometimes, of course, it's a bit of a con, because what doctors have done for years is just take what you tell them and put it into Latin and then play it back to you. So if you say you've got you come to them and say, I've got achy, inflamed joints. They say, oh, yes, you've got arthritis, which just basically means inflamed joints. It doesn't actually mean anything more than that. As we've started analyzing in depth the biology, we've now got the whole human genome. We can measure what cells are making in terms of how they're transcribing DNA. We can measure all the molecules in urine and blood and so forth. When you start doing that, you find that a lot of diseases that you think of as one thing aren't. So motor neurone disease, one version of that, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis or Lou Gehrig's disease, that everyone would say, well, I know what motor neurone disease is. That's really obvious. That's one disease. Well, it's not. At least 23 different genes with variants in them, in various combinations, with lots of other combinations that modify it, ends up with that end effect, which is why if you treat all of motor neuron disease in a trial with one drug, it's unlikely to work, because you're not really dealing with one disease entity. And to be able to work that out requires massive computational power of artificial intelligence. But we also need it for identifying which drug will work for whom, to help us with prognostication. And indeed, there's an awful lot of stuff that doctors do that we're not really very good at. Humans, for instance, aren't wired for anomaly detection in what we see. Humans are wired for facial recognition. Is that someone I know? Are they part of my family? Are they part of my tribe? Are they a potential mate? Are they about to kill me? Are they ill? We're not designed to look at X-rays and slides and spot the anomaly. Other animals are very good at it. Pigeons, for instance, outperform humans on a lot of diagnostic test analysis because they're good at spotting anomalies because they're wired to do it. But we can build computers to do that. And that's going to be the biggest win, I think, is computer image analysis for X-rays. You know, humans miss breast cancers on mammograms up to a third of the time. And it's not because they're stupid or lazy. It's because humans aren't built to do that. And a computer can be built to do that. But as I say, it's not the answer for saving the health service is not just more technology, it's less disease. And we do need both to go hand in hand. We need to turn the tap off quickly.
I love the fact that pigeons can do this. I'm never going to look at a pigeon in the same way again. I'm going to think, what is that pigeon seeing when it looks at me? And all of this, you know, AI being able to help us and to do so much, it's a total waste of time, really, if we have no Earth left, right? If right. Humans cannot survive. So let's go back to the fact that you're sitting there in a woolly hat in your flat. Clearly, this is something that you're doing to personally respond to climate change. What can we be doing, and how big a threat is it now?
The threat's absolutely huge. Greenhouse gases essentially let shortwave radiation in the form of light, and they trap longwave radiation in the form of heat. And we've added so much, and we are still adding so much, that we've trapped north of 30 billion Hiroshima bombs worth of energy in our atmosphere and oceans since 1998 alone. And we're adding 5 Hiroshima bombs of energy a second now. The CO2 we're adding doesn't go away quickly. A fifth of it will still be cooking us in 33,000 years' time, and 7% will be cooking us in 100,000 years' time. And if you add energy to an atmosphere, it's not just that the temperature goes up, and you get weather. The more energy you add, the more extreme weather you'll get. And everyone listening to this will recognize the fires everywhere in the world, whether it's Angola and the Congo, Siberia, Australia, California, Canada last summer, for instance, the floods we saw last year across Europe, Belgium, Germany, London. But we're seeing this year, KwaZulu-Natal underwater, Valencia has been underwater this year in Spain, but we've had this massive heat wave in India. We're having these huge temperature anomalies now. The Arctic and Antarctic are warming 3 times quicker than the rest of the world. And earlier this year in March, the Antarctic was 47 degrees Celsius hotter than normal. We've triggered 6 positive feedback loops now. So each of those interact. So you melt ice, for instance, it reflects less heat back. There's more dark ocean and salt to absorb the heat, which means it's hotter, which means that more ice melts. You melt methane hydrates, ferment soil to create more methane, for instance. Those add to more heat, which means there's more methane release, but also more snow and ice melt. We have 6 of those now interacting. The major rainforests of the world are all now net carbon emitters because we've chopped down so much of them and they're becoming so dry. So we are in for absolute catastrophe now. And this isn't an issue for future generations. It's for us. Politicians have done nothing at all. There have been 26 COP negotiations, which have all been about conversation. Nothing meaningful has come from them. And this means it all comes down to us. The positive news is that if we all do act together, things will change. We can move our money in our buying habits very, very quickly. And the pension funds and hedge funds will follow. And so will governments. They'll fill that permissive environment we create. But this is a call to arms for every single one of us to be taking action. Meaningful, substantial, dramatic, and now. Not a little bit of recycling here and there, much as recycling is good.
Okay, so tell us exactly what can we do? Give us a list.
All right. Well, first thing is you can do what I'm doing with your heating. That's an obvious one, just since I'm sitting here. Every degree you turn your heating down is 7 to 11% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. Actually, and it's 7 to 11% reduction in your bill. So turning your heating down 5 degrees saves you potentially 50% of the emissions straight off from your heating. or do what I'm doing today. I haven't got the heating on at all. It is chilly, I have to say. I'm not completely comfortable. I might get a blanket in a minute or put an extra shirt on, but I can insulate myself perfectly well. And we've worked out already that you and I are a similar age. And when we were growing up, of course, you and I didn't have central heating. You might have had a fire in one room, but that's where you sat. And if you said to your dad, I'm cold, he said, well, go and put another jumper on then.
He did indeed. And he used to go around turning all the lights off as well.
That's right. So we need to do all of those things. If people listening to this are not with a genuine 100% renewable electricity supplier, it's dead easy to switch. Because of the weirdness of the way the markets are set up, your bill won't drop because you're on a renewable tariff, because gas prices are high. Weirdly, the way the grid works means you have to bear some of that price. But you can get all of your electricity 100% renewable. I can be honest, I don't own shares in any of the companies, but Good Energy are brilliant. If you don't like them, there are plenty of others, but do check there are generally 100% renewable. So that's a good move. Food is really important. Methane is 83 times as powerful a greenhouse gas as carbon dioxide is in the first 20 years. And it's a really, we've got to get on top of that quickly. And the bit that we can all control, apart from natural gas, because natural gas has been rebranded. Natural gas is methane, interesting enough, just the same as chewing gum is mostly plastic. It's just that it's given a different name to make it sound good. So apart from burning the methane supplies, the big thing is agriculture, and that's ruminant animals, which is sheep, but mainly cattle. They just belch a lot of methane, which is why when you hear about moving to a diet that's seasonable, local, and vegetable based, that's a really, really big win. So if I came to your house and you had cooked me steak, if I'm honest, I will say thank you very much and I'll eat it because it's polite to do that. But I don't buy it for myself. And that's something we can all do. Milk, of course, the same thing, has a massive carbon footprint because the cows are belching methane. You're chopping down rainforests to graze them and the soya as well. But you also have to pasteurize them, which means flash heating them to over 70 degrees, the milk, and then flash cooling it and then refrigerating it. So when you look at my coffee, which is my drug of choice, if you look at the beans that are grown, then transported and roasted and separated, and the solutes taken out, and coffee powder is reconstituted, and then glass sand is melted to make glass, and the plastic lid's put on it, and it's shipped around the world to my local shop, and I buy it, and I then look at the water that's been pumped and chlorinated into my house, and I boil a kettle, and I make my coffee. The carbon footprint of the splash of milk, I would add, is more than the entire carbon footprint of the rest of that. So then, hence the move away from milk to, if you want to things like oat milk. That's my substitute. These sorts of things really do matter. Moving your money. Most of the banks are wrong in what they do. They fund deforestation. They fund the fossil fuel industry. There are banks that don't. So I'm with the cooperative bank. Again, I don't have shares. I'm not sure you could have shares in them, but they don't fund fossil fuel industry and they don't fund deforestation. All of these small things are small and they can make you feel, well, it doesn't matter, if you look at the size of China or India or whatever, but they really do matter. And every single one of us, the advertisers tell us, can change the behaviors of 7 other people. There's 7 other people who love us or respect us enough to follow our lead. And each of those triggers 7. You can do your own maths. Every one of us can create a colossal change in the world. And we have to. We can't leave this to other people now. And of course, the final bit is we just got to buy less stuff. We can be more efficient in what we do. But the main thing is just to think, do I really need that? And I'm as bad as everyone. I'm doing a talk on a computer. I've got a mobile phone giving me the signal. But we've got to try to go away from this instant buying, want it now, can have anything I like mode. A lot of fast fashion means that clothing is only worn 2 or 3 times before it's thrown in a bin because it's cheap. And that's insane. We just need to move away from those sorts of things. Yeah, there you are. There's a quick recipe list for you.
That's fantastic. And I love you enough, Hugh, to make some changes. And I've got my list, and I shall revisit this, and I shall share this as well widely. Thank you so much. That's been an incredible discussion. I've really found that fascinating, enjoyable, and I've learned a lot. I hope it was comfortable for you in your cold room there.
Yes, I shall move around a bit now. I'm getting slightly chilly, but it's good of you to spend the time to talk. And thank you for having me.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for listening to the Speaking Business podcast. I hope you have enjoyed this episode. And if you did, please leave a rating on Apple Podcasts. But more importantly, especially in this case with the content we've shared today, tell your friends and share it. And until next time, I've been Maria Franzoni, and bye-bye from me for now.